And it would only be fair to now allow the Honourable Pat McNamara to have his say. Pat, of course, was the Deputy Premier of Victoria from 1992 to 1999 and the leader of the National Party in Victoria from 1988 to 1999. During the term of government, Pat held numerous ministerial positions, including the Minister for Tourism, the Minister for Agriculture and Resources. Since leaving Parliament, Pat has served as a member of the MCG Trust, Chairman of the Victorian Bushfire Appeal Fund, Board Member of the Voice of Horticulture Proprietary Limited, representing horticulture across Australia, a Board Member of Wine Victoria, Victorian Councillor for Rowing Australia, and in his spare time, the Deputy Chair of the Goulburn Murray Water. Pat, thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff, for that introduction. To my colleague Steve, to Jade Grant, who's been supporting this project, Steph Ryan, representing the opposition parties, James Flintoff, Head of Regional Development Victoria, representing the Minister. I've got to mention my local CEO of our local government, Steve Crocker. Welcome also. Steve and I always got on very well. In fact, after it looked like we lost the 1990 election, we had about 5 weeks in caretaker mode. And Steve had a chat to me. He said, look, it wouldn't be possible that we could form a coalition. And I said, well, you know, I said the best, I'm not sure whether our members are quite ready for that, but I said the best that Jeff Kennett's offering me is Deputy Premier. I said, can you do any better? And he said, I'm not sure if his colleagues were quite ready for that. But I'd always look forward to the opportunity in working with Steve. We worked in a bipartisan fashion in many ways over the years, but we come together on this project, which I think is just so critical for the future of Victoria. And politics shouldn't be part of this. This is too important an issue. I think we just need to address it. Steve spoke about 2 of the 4 pillars. I'd like to talk about 2 of the others. And one is setting targets, and the other is looking for areas across the state beyond our largest regional centres. Targets for anything, I think, are essential for any sort of policy, and Dwight Eisenhower made the comment. He said, "You get what you inspect, not what you expect." I think we need to ensure that we actually measure what we're doing, and we need to actually have targets as part of that process to measure our performance. And decentralisation needs to be more than just a catch cry. It needs to be something that leads to an actual outcome. So the challenges are out there, and in many cases, well, we know they're more than real. What we're facing today are real challenges that are certainly proving to be almost intractable. We've got the congestion issue, and we see that every day we commute in and out of the centre of Melbourne, or anywhere in Melbourne for that matter. We've got livability issues, we've got housing affordability issues, we've got cost of living. I think all of that needs people to really force to have a rethink on how we actually plan Melbourne and how we deal with its growth for the best interests of all of Victoria and particularly for the citizens of Melbourne. The first step that stands out is our forecasting, because it's been abysmal. If we look at all the projections that we've seen over decades, we've completely undershot what people have predicted for the growth of Melbourne. We had an ABS study back in 2003 that said Melbourne would actually reach 25 million people in 2042. So we're 24 years ahead of that target. We've been revising our mid-century population forecast upwards every census since, and we're still not getting it right. Plan Melbourne predicts that Victoria will grow by 4.1 million by 2050, but that figure could easily be 5, 6 or 7. We're looking at another 3.4 million people under the Plan Melbourne study and 700,000 going to regional Victoria, and that'll see Melbourne with a population of around 8 million. But some estimates are already saying that Melbourne by 2050 could reach 11 million. That's bigger than what London is now. And it's probably worth looking at what London's done in terms of development. London has a population twice the size of Melbourne, but a footprint 1/6. So the density is 1/12 of what we've got now. The way in which we've just allowed the suburbs to spread out in terms of serviceability, in terms of connection, in terms of public transport, all of those issues become harder to deliver. So are we the norm in Australia? I think it's worth having a look at Great Britain, for instance. They've got 66.5 million people at present. London has a population of 10 million, but there's only one other city, Birmingham, that has a population of more than 1 million people. So the British, with a landmass in the whole of the UK of 3% of Australia, has managed to have diversification right across the country, far better than what we've achieved. In the USA, with a population of 327 million, there are only 10 cities that have more than 1 million residents. Australia, with 25 million, we have 5 cities. We have 2 cities that have 40% of our population. We have 5 cities that have 60% of our population. This is not the norm globally. In Canada, the 2 largest cities, Montreal and Toronto, hold a total of 28% of the country's population. In Japan, the 2 largest cities, Tokyo and Yokohama, hold less than 10%. What we need in Victoria is not a city-state, but we need a state of cities. And the purpose of decentralisation is not only to reduce the cost that's brought about by our rapidly growing population, which is far in excess of what we even saw during the gold rush period in the 1850s, to ensure that we actually share that economic growth across the state. We need also to have a long-term commitment, and it needs to be a commitment above politics. It needs to be a commitment over a 30-year period. As governments change and go, we need to be bound by that commitment. Such a program should set a target. We believe the target should be aiming to get at least half of the predicted growth that is coming to Melbourne into regional Victoria. So out of the 3.4 million people, 1.7 of those need to be encouraged to move to regional Victoria. We're certainly uniquely positioned, and Steve has outlined that. We're geographically, in Australian terms, we're a compact state with a large population growing rapidly, and that provides advantages. It enables us to get high-speed transport through high-speed rail, through a decentralisation program, target areas in the regions, and ensure that we provide an opportunity for those people to either live and work in those new regional cities or to commute easily to the metropolitan area. And I think we'd find over a period of time people might start commuting from an area, say 100 to 150 kilometres out, where they could get back into the city of Melbourne within 20 to 30 minutes, but over a period of time, many of those people will establish their own businesses or take their own professional careers to those areas and develop their businesses there. I think we shouldn't fall into the trap of imagining that a meaningful decentralisation program is impossible, because much of our land certainly lends itself to human settlement. We think about Australia as a desolate country, but we have a large proportion of the country is very arable, well watered. In fact, 10% of our country fits into that qualification. And that area is larger than the UK and France combined. So we have the space, we have the water, we have the regions that are desperate to share in that economic growth. Unfortunately, we have disproportionate flows that are happening at the moment. So that leads me to the second and final point. The task of distributing 1.7 million people into the regions by 2050, we need to have a rethink on how we actually make those settlements happen. And I think we need to look at the growth perhaps in smaller country towns or greenfield developments. And this is for a number of reasons. Our largest regional centres are already growing. Ballarat and Bendigo have been predicted to double from 100,000 to 200,000 each by 2050. And Geelong's on the track to go from its current population of 235,000 to 400,000 in that same period. Some interesting points about the growth of what we'd call the big 3 regional centres. Firstly, most of that growth is off the back of net migration from neighbouring rural shires. And while we're talking about people leaving Melbourne to those regional centres, that's just not happening. In fact, the total numbers over the last 5 years on an annual basis that have left Melbourne to go to Ballarat, Bendigo and Geelong is a total of 1,300 people. 188 go to Bendigo a year, 200 go to Ballarat and 900 go to Geelong. At the same time, Melbourne's growing by over 120,000 people a year. So significantly, it's an insignificant statistic. We need to do more than the same old to achieve a better outcome. So the current policies are not working. Although people espouse a support for decentralisation, we need a game changer. What we need to do, I think, also is to think about those issues when we start talking to people in Ballarat, Bendigo and Geelong, because I think we run into another issue. Do those communities, say communities like Ballarat and Bendigo of 100,000, want to grow to 500,000, which they need to grow to achieve these targets, or Geelong growing from 235,000 to 1 million? I suspect there's going to be a radical pushback if that was a policy we tried to direct. We've seen what's happened with the Save Our Suburbs in those ring of suburbs outside of the CBD in Melbourne. We know it's government policy to have infill. So in the Kews and the Camberwells and these areas to put up 2 and 3 and 4-storey blocks of flats. But we know what the adjoining residents say every time there's a planning application for that to happen. You know, it's the NIMBY approach, not in my backyard. So what are the developers doing? They're going to Point Cook, they're going to Craigieburn, and we see the continual sprawl, Los Angeles style. So what we're saying is that we need to identify greenfield sites. They might be within 10, 20 kilometres of one of those regional cities, but they're starting from fresh. And we're dealing with rural shires who actually want the growth, who want to be part of the growth that is happening in Victoria now, and the people coming in there understand where the long-term outcome is. And the great advantage, I think, starting with new cities from scratch, with Martin and the guys at the RMIT who've been doing some fantastic work, we've been looking at ways in which we actually create truly smart cities. We look at ways in which those cities could be energy self-sufficient, with renewable energy, with battery storage, with recyclable water, total capture of storm water, all the efficiencies that we need to have. 2 types of piping systems, one for your garden, one for your drinking water. So we'd be using a fraction of the amount of water on a per capita basis or a household basis that you'd be using in Melbourne. And I think it would also open up the state to some great things in terms of innovation. I'm totally excited about this concept, and so is Steve, and we didn't hesitate when we were invited to be part of it. But we think it needs an approach where we've all got to be passionate about this. We've got to get out and sell it. We've got to see the opportunity where people living, as I said, 100 kilometres out of Melbourne can get into the city in 20 minutes, or 150 kilometres out of Melbourne, in 30 minutes, or living, even further afield at 200 kilometres could get there in about 40 minutes. So on a Friday night, if you want to go to the football, or if you wanted to go to a show or a dinner in Melbourne, any night of the week, it's something you could commute up and down very easily. And I think that's the game changer for Victoria. This is not something that we're putting up as a thought piece. It is a thought piece. It's a thought piece we hope people do think about. But it's something that actually needs to be acted on, and it needs to be acted on promptly. Thank you.